Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening for this public meeting to gather feedback on the proposed changes to the Sa-Hali. I'm good. Sorry. Good evening again, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening to gather feedback on the proposed changes to the Sa-Hali and South Kamloops Secondary School catchment boundaries. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the traditional territory of the Secwepemc people. I'm joined this evening by Vice Chair Wade, Trustee Grieve, Trustee Sim, Trustee McKelvey, Trustee O'Fee, Trustee Small, and Trustee Karpak. Trustee Jules will be joining us shortly. She will should make the presentations, just sends her regrets as she's had some traffic trouble. I'd like to let everybody know that due to the format of the evening, trustees will not be on screen during the presentations, but we'll be listening carefully to the feedback that's presented. Before I turn this meeting over to Superintendent Sullivan, I would ask trustees if they'd wish to bring any greetings or make any comment before we begin. Seeing none, we'll welcome you. Before we begin, I would like to thank staff for this extensive work done to date on proposed revisions to school catchments. Oh, and welcome Trustee Jules. We're just getting started. The board understands this could be a disruptive process to communities, and we appreciate any feedback that we are given before we make any decisions. We look forward to hearing your suggestions and comments. And with that, I will turn the meeting over to Superintendent Sullivan. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this public meeting regarding the proposed changes to the catchment areas for Sa-Hali Secondary and Kamloops Secondary School, which also affects Dufferin Elementary School. I want to outline how we would like to proceed this evening. I will first ask Mr. Art McDonald, our Director of Facilities, to give an overview of these changes so there is an understanding of why staff is proposing these changes to the Board of Education. Following Mr. McDonald's presentation, I will then ask Mr. Bill Hamlet, the Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Education, and Ms. Trish Smiley, the Assistant Superintendent of Elementary Education, to comment on the educational impact of the proposed changes. And after Assistant Superintendents Hamlet and Smiley make their comments, I will then ask the Secretary Treasurer, Mr. Calvin Stretch, to make comments with respect to any financial impact that might occur as a result of these proposed changes. After Secretary Treasurer Stretch has made his comments, we will then begin listening to submissions on the proposed changes by those who have pre-booked a time on the agenda for this evening. And those who have booked the time to make a presentation this evening have been allotted a 10-minute time period to make your presentation, and we would ask that you please respect the 10-minute allotment so that everyone will have an opportunity to make their comments. I will be giving a 2-minute signal prior to the end of the presentation so that you will have an opportunity to sum up. We intend to complete our meeting no later than 8:30 p.m. In addition to the formal presentations this evening, we will also be providing an opportunity for those of you who want to raise a question or make a comment through either Facebook or YouTube. We may not be able to answer all these questions this evening, but any questions that we cannot answer will be posted to the Sa-Hali SKSS consultation page, which is linked to the Dufferin, Sa-Hali, SKSS, and district websites with a response to the questions that have been asked. That public link will also remain open until June the 4th, so members of the public can post questions and receive a response. All questions and responses to questions will remain viewable publicly throughout this consultation period. In addition to the public meeting this evening, I will also be meeting with the PAC executive of each affected school, and our assistant superintendents will also be meeting with the staff of each affected school. All of the information and input obtained through these consultation meetings will be consolidated and presented to the Board of Education prior to the board making any decision on these proposed changes. As you are aware, all members of the Board of Education are present this evening to listen to your presentations, but I want to stress that no decision will be made this evening. The decision on these changes will be made at the public board meeting on June the 14th. Also this evening, we only have 2 presentations. So what I would like to do after the presentations are complete, we have a list of questions that have been submitted prior to this meeting. And what I propose to do, because we only have the 2 presentations, is go through each of those questions, and we're going to try to respond to those questions as we work through this meeting this evening. This meeting is being recorded, of course, and that means that if there are those who were not able to make the meeting this evening, you will be able to access it through our website in the days and weeks ahead prior to the board making a decision. So that completes the outline of the process we will follow this evening. So Director McDonald, would you please provide some context to our consultation process and an overview of what we're proposing?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. So I will give a presentation. Most of it are excerpts from the most recent long-range facility plan that was presented to the board about a month ago. So just the agenda, as Dr. Sullivan has already gone through. A little bit of background on school catchments. School catchments are not permanent. Each school has a limited capacity in the neighborhood that it serves is constantly changing. Changing demographics and legislative changes can affect the enrollment of the school. And periodically, the board will review school enrollments relative to catchment areas and make changes where necessary. And with this process, the board is considering changing 4 catchment boundaries and reopening Ralph Bell Elementary for September 2022. So as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, a lot of this is to give you an overview as to why we're here. As part of our long-range facility plan, we do enrollment projections. And as you can see from this graph going out to 2030, we're expecting very robust and strong enrollment increases. We're seeing a lot of influx of people from other areas of the province as well as from other provinces. And we expect that to continue for at least the near, if not long-term future. This slide is about district-wide capacity utilization, and capacity utilization is simply the enrollment divided by the capacity of the school. The capacities are defined by the Ministry of Education.
We're not, excuse me, Mr. McDonald, we're not seeing your PowerPoint, so I think you have to share your screen.
Thank you. Sorry for that. So district-wide capacity utilization, as I mentioned, is simply the enrollment divided by the capacity of the school as defined by the ministry. And in 2008, 2009, district-wide, we were at 77%. Some of you may have been around long enough to remember we went through a different process back then in terms of consolidating schools. This year in September, we were at 92% district-wide, and with our forecasted enrollment projections, 5 years, we're looking to be 98%, and in 10 years, we're looking to be 105% district-wide. As far as the Kamloops area schools are concerned for this meeting, for this year at elementary, we're at 116%. At secondary, we're at 97%. 5 years out at elementary, 123%. And secondary, 99%. And the reason that doesn't increase significantly at the secondary level is we account for the additional capacity at Valley View Secondary once we open the new addition. And 10 years out, 133% for elementary and 107% at secondary. Again, related, not necessarily to Sa-Hali Secondary and South Kamloops Secondary, at the elementary school level, we've got a lot of pressures. You can see from this chart, our top 6 schools as far as enrollment pressures, and similarly, they all are going to experience growth into the near and long-term future. The South Shore Secondary Schools, Sa-Hali Secondary is currently in 129% capacity utilization. South Campbell Secondary is at 92%, with Sa-Hali going to 154% in 5 years and 180% in 10 years. And South Kamloops Secondary hovering around the 100% mark. Now, what we look at too as part of the long-range facility plan is how do we plan on handling these enrollment growths? So the southwest sector for elementary, we have in our capital plan a new school in Pineview Valley, a new school in Aberdeen East. Now a little further out, a new school in Aberdeen West. As part of this process, we have proposed a catchment review for Aberdeen Elementary and Pacific Way Elementary to relieve pressure at Pacific Way Elementary. And then further down the road, once Pineview Valley Elementary is built, complete another catchment review between McGowan Park Elementary and Pacific Way Elementary, as McGowan Park Elementary will have space once Pineview Valley Elementary is complete. For the Southwest Secondary Schools, we've got a ministry-funded capital project, which is a new school in Aberdeen. And as part of our interim measures, the reason we're here tonight is a catchment review for Sa-Hali Secondary and South Kamloops Secondary to relieve pressure at Sa-Hali Secondary. And the goal here is not to fix the overcapacity problems, but it's really to share the problem between the two schools. And we're also suggesting to review shifting some of the international student population at Sa-Hali Secondary to other secondary schools, again, to decrease the enrollment to a more manageable level. Now, district-wide at the next 5 years, until the school district receives capital funding for projects, the school district will need to respond to enrollment pressures internally, as we have had to do traditionally. Based on that, this is more at the elementary level, we're looking at repurposing 22 rooms for classroom spaces and adding another 35 portables. Part of our capital plan submission to the ministry, we have a new elementary school in Pineview Valley, new elementary school in Bachelor Heights, a secondary school in Aberdeen, a new elementary school in Juniper West, and a K-12 school in Sun Peaks. And then we will be adding a new school in Aberdeen East to our capital plan submission this year. So for this proposed catchment change, currently Sa-Hali Secondary is operating 129% with 7 portables. South Kamloops is currently operating at 92%. Redirecting Dufferin Elementary students from Sa-Hali Secondary to South Kamloops will provide a more balanced operational capacity. As I mentioned earlier, it's trying to share some of the overcapacity issues. And the other one that's tied to this is potentially the Aberdeen Elementary, Pacific Way Elementary catchment change would also send more students to South Kamloops Secondary. So the number of students affected based on current numbers, if the switch was made and everybody switches from Sa-Hali Secondary to South Kamloops Secondary, would be 132 students. Now this chart, again, it was in the memo that the superintendent provided to the board for rationale as to why we're proposing this. The upper chart shows the current enrollment projections if we do nothing. So you can see Sa-Hali Secondary goes from this year at 936, predicted up to 1,302 in 2030. And the bottom chart shows the redistributed students and what it would look like if this catchment change is made. So for Sa-Hali Secondary, it goes from 936 to 1,100, which is still over capacity, but less over capacity. And similarly, South Kamloops eventually becomes over capacity, but not as bad as Sa-Hali. So as far as catchment maps, everything in yellow is the current Sa-Hali Secondary catchment. The red is the current South Kamloops Secondary catchment. As far as looking up in the Aberdeen area. With the proposed change, you can see that the South Kamloops Secondary catchment goes up the page, which is the Dufferin area, and also down the page to include the proposed Aberdeen Elementary, Pacific Way Elementary catchment change as well. And that is it for me, Dr. Sullivan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald, for your presentation. I'm now going to ask Assistant Superintendent Hamlet, followed by Assistant Superintendent Smiley, just to make some comments with respect to the educational perspective or educational impact as a result of these proposed changes. Mr. Hamlet.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. The class sizes are standardized by the collective agreement, and therefore students in a school, more students in a school does not simply equate to more students in each class. Enrollment pressures impact common areas in the school. Overcrowded hallways, shortages of lockers, gym and field use, food services, shortage of specialty classrooms like home economic labs or classrooms, library use, and increased traffic concerns. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the class sizes are set by the collective agreement, and in English and science lab classes, the class size limit is 28. Home economic classes are at 26. Industrial education classes are at 24, and other secondary classes are at 29. And these maximum class size limits are also reduced by 1 for each student categorized as a low incidence. Next slide. When we look at Dufferin Elementary and what South Cam Secondary could offer, it's very similar to Sa-Hali. Both schools have an 8 through 12 program. Although South Kamloops is a dual track French immersion school, there is a robust English program, and they have the same senior electives. Students across the district have the opportunity to participate in district programs regardless of the high school they attend, whether that is the International Baccalaureate program or the Trades and Transitions programs. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Assistant Superintendent Trish Smiley.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Hamlet. No changes are being proposed to the Dufferin Elementary through this feeder school change. There are 2 items that may impact Dufferin Elementary students feeding into South Cam as a result of these proposed changes. First, accommodations will be made to ensure families can remain together at the same secondary school. Students who attend Dufferin with siblings in Sa-Hali will be able to choose to attend Sa-Hali or choose to feed into South Kamloops Secondary as proposed. Second, if students attending Dufferin Elementary are out of catchment area students, meaning they've transferred to Dufferin for their elementary education, when the out of catchment area student transitions to high school, they will attend their catchment area school. For example, if a student living in the North Shore has transferred to Dufferin, once they transition to the secondary school, they will then register at Brocklehurst Middle School. And then if this student wishes to attend South Kamloops Secondary with their Dufferin peers, they'll be required to request a transfer to this school. Secretary Treasurer Stretch will now provide his comments.
Thank you very much. And good evening. Although catchment area changes do not have implications on district funding, I'll share some basic information on how we are funded for our day-to-day operations, how capital projects are funded, including existing space, new space, and portable classrooms. This presentation will be posted on our website, so you can access the link to the Ministry of Education's K-12 operating grants information that's listed there, rather than have you try to jot that down quickly. This site includes information for all 60 public school districts in the province, the estimates for 21-22 school year, and the information on funding goes all the way back to 2001-2002 school year. Enrollment-based funding, or per FTE, which is what we mostly refer to it, we have a list of enrollment that captures FTE. And so we've got our standard school enrollment, our continuing education, distributed learning, which is our online, alternate schools, and homeschooling. In addition to enrollment-based funding, we have supplementary funding, which is also provided on a per FTE basis in the following categories: special needs, English language learner, Indigenous education, adult education, and this is just the non-graduated adults, and equity of opportunity supplement. In addition to the enrollment-based funding, supplementary funding is provided for unique geographic factors. So those would be small community supplement, the low enrollment factor, rural factor, climate factor, sparseness factor, and student location factor. It's a complex formula for how K-12 public schools are funded, but the complexity attempts to treat large versus small districts, as well as urban versus rural districts, with appropriate funding to deliver similar educational services to all students in the province. Districts are not funded for space. Districts do not, they do receive an annual facility grant, but these are funds used to just maintain and upkeep existing space. And districts do not receive funding for portables. Portables are not funded because districts tend to add portables based on enrollment growth. And enrollment growth generates additional per FTE funding, which is needed to pay for additional staff and supplies, which may include the addition of portables. The Ministry of Education approves and fund capital expansions and new schools. And that's based on the capital plan submission that we provide each year that Director McDonald referred to and prepares. Once districts are expected to contribute to the capital project based on their ability to contribute. So if you get an approval, they review your reserve balances and your ability to pay, and you have an obligation to contribute to the capital plan. If school sites are required, a school site acquisition charge must be in place. You've probably seen something in the media recently to indicate that the school district is working with the city to conclude the school site acquisition charge, which that charge assists districts in purchasing land for new schools. Capital projects in the last 20 years and the district's contribution by project is as follows. We had the NORCAM Trades Edition. The district contributed $1.1 million. The Valley View expansion, which is currently taking place now, the district's obligation is $1,750,000. And Parkrest, which is, we're obligated to pay for a small portion of the expanded school that will be rebuilt based on the fire. So the existing school was 360 student capacity, and the new one is 510. And so the district's obligation is $300,000. And that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Hamlet, Assistant Superintendent Smiley, and Secretary Treasurer Stretch. We have 2 requests for presentations tonight, so we'll introduce those 2 presenters and have them present after the presentations, because we will have some time. As I said, I intend to work through the questions that have been asked in advance. We also will have some questions on the chats. If we have questions on the chats, we'll also work through those. I see one there now. So once we complete the presentations and I go through the questions that have been submitted in advance, we'll have a look at the chat and see if there's questions there that we can answer as well. So we have 2 requests for presentation tonight. The first is Mr. Jeff Murphy. So welcome, Mr. Murphy. Please begin your presentations. You'll have 10 minutes, and I'll cue you when you have 2 minutes left to sum up. So Mr. Murphy, please.
Hi, thank you for having me. Can you speak to the history of this encatchment a little bit? I'd like to understand, I understand that South Cam also at one point in time had the Aberdeen catchment, and there was a change. I'm just curious about the history of this because I only have a boy in grade 10. I have a younger one coming up, but I'd just like to understand the history. And I'd also like to understand maybe what alternatives to this has the school district considered, or if any, to this change. Yeah, specifically, I mean, I'm just wondering if they've ever considered just a voluntary change. So are there families out there that want to voluntarily switch schools because of some of the things that South Cam offers, i.e. the French program? Thanks.
Thank you. So did you have a presentation you would like to make, or was it the question you wanted us to respond to?
No, just a couple of questions. Thanks.
All right, I'll try to give some context, and then I'll ask Mr. McDonald or the others if they would like to comment. I'll start by saying, and I was here in 2002 when we projected our enrollments. We had close to 20 years of enrollment decline. We went from over 18,000 students down to 14. We predicted that that was going to occur. It occurred as we indicated it would. In 2000, we said in 2000, back in 2002, we said in 2014, we would be just under 14,000 students. That was what occurred. We then indicated at that time, way back in 2002, that we would start to see some increase in enrollment. So we predicted that, and it pretty well happened as we predicted. But what we could not predict, and what we did not predict, was a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2017 around class size and class composition. And that's not a criticism of that decision. I don't want to perceive that, anyone to perceive that it is. It's just a reality that when that decision came down, it meant immediately there was an additional 4,100 teachers in British Columbia, most of those being classroom teachers. For this district, it meant 98 additional teachers and 90 additional classroom teachers. So we had to put in place immediately 90 additional classroom spaces. So that ate up any excess space we had and then some. And that put us into the situation that we are into now. And as Mr. McDonald has gone through, we're seeing these pressures as a result in a number of our schools. And Sa-Hali Secondary School, if we do nothing, if we continue to allow this to occur, its capacity, it's going to be close to 200%. It's going to be 100% over what it was built to accommodate. So those are just not tenable situations, and the elementary schools are some of the elementary schools are in similar circumstances. So what we're trying to do, there's some excess capacity at South Cam, and so as Mr. McDonald has said, we're trying to even that out in some way by redirecting students from Dufferin to South Cam, and we've accommodated, as Assistant Superintendent Smiley said, we certainly don't want to break up families or siblings, so we'll accommodate that. And there could be other situations that we haven't anticipated that we will have to deal with. But that's kind of an overview of the history and what got us to the point where we are now. But I'll ask Mr. McDonald, who's been kind of steeped in the data, if there's any further comments that he wants to make to try and answer your question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. I guess to answer the second part, as far as alternatives, in the long term, a few years ago, we were contemplating an addition to Sa-Hali Secondary. But as the city keeps growing, it's become evident that that addition will not provide space long term. So that's why you'll note early in the presentation I mentioned we have on our capital plan a new high school in Aberdeen. We feel long-term that is the right option. And again, we are beholden to the Ministry of Education to provide the funding. And we are really on their time frame for that. As far as the catchment changes, as best we can, and I understand it's not perfect, we try, when we look at catchment changes, we try to look at either discrete neighborhoods or discrete street areas that somewhat make sense, at least to us. And it's also a bit of, trying to balance the numbers where, if we move this area, how many students is that? If we move a different area, how many students is that? And again, it's really just trying to take some pressure out of Sa-Hali Secondary, because we believe long-term that, at close to 200%, it just becomes a very untenable situation for the school and the staff. That's it for now. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Murphy, does that answer your question, or do you have a further question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I realize that it's really a no-win situation, and as the city continues to grow, it's just kind of frustrating, because I can see how you're trying to plan things out, but it's just so hard to plan 10 years out. I mean, look at real estate and what's going on around Kamloops right now. It's pretty crazy, and I look forward to seeing when an Aberdeen secondary could come along, because it just seems like we're masking every few years. We're moving students around and masking the problem, but I realize that it's a tough situation. So thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your question. Now, we did have one other presenter, but I believe that presenter has withdrawn. Is that correct? So what I want to do now is I want to get into the questions that were submitted previously and try and respond to those questions. As I said, this is being recorded, so I expect that other folks are going to want to access this, and so they can see that we've tried to respond to these questions as well. First question is, will children already attending high school be able to complete their high school career at their current school with their friend group? So Mr. Hamlet or Ms. Smiley, would either of you like to respond to that question?
I can try, Dr. Sullivan.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you so much. So when the district's position is, when you're already attending a high school, we're not going to pull you from that school to move you to another school. So you would be able to, children would be able to complete their education in the high school they're attending.
Yeah, so they originally came from Dufferin and they're in grade 10. That doesn't mean that, or Sa-Hali, sorry, and they're in grade 10. That doesn't mean they're going to switch to South Cam. They're going to finish their high school in Sa-Hali. Yeah. Second question, will a child's feeder elementary school be a consideration for high school placement or only their home address? Maybe Ms. Smiley, you might want to respond to that. We did discuss it, I think.
Sure, I'd be happy to, Superintendent Sullivan. As I mentioned in my presentation, if students attending Dufferin are outside of their catchment area, they would and they've transferred into Dufferin for their elementary education. When they're out of catchment and they're transitioning to their high school, they'll attend their catchment area school. So I gave an example about the North Shore. They would register in Brocklehurst Middle School to complete their schooling. And if they wish to transfer with their Dufferin peers, then of course they will apply for a student transfer.
Thank you, Ms. Smiley. My son, third question, my son specifically wants to take the digital media courses offered at Sa-Hali and not at SKSS. Will there be opportunities for students with a specific course plan to remain at Sa-Hali if they are in the Dufferin area? So, Mr. Hamlet.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. So in particular, Sa-Hali is known for what used to be called the DigiPen, or now the data program. And that's a district program. So regardless of what high school a student attends, they'd be able to access that district program. In my presentation, I mentioned that regardless of the high school, students could access any district program, whether it's the International Baccalaureate program or Trades and Transitions. So there'll be opportunities for students to access those specific courses.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hamlet. So the answer to that is yes. 4, will students be grandfathered if they will be entering their final graduating year with Sa-Hali? And I think we responded to that, and we're not going to move students out of a high school into the other high school as a result of the change in the catchment to Dufferin. So they will continue in the high school where they presently attend. Number 5, what does it look like for bell schedule and bus schedules at South Kamloops? Will they match up with Dufferin? What does that look like? We will require time enough to drop off and pick up at both schools daily, morning and afternoon, or would we be busing both kids home? So any comments on that? Can we respond to that? Either Mr. McDonald, Ms. Smiley, or Mr. Hamlet, or all three?
Dr. Sullivan, we do have Manager Christensen on the call, and she might be able to speak to bus schedules. I don't believe that there will be significant changes, but she would be the one to comment.
All right, Sherry, would you like to comment on that question? I'll repeat it again just to make sure it's a longer question, just to make sure we get it properly. What does it look like for bell schedule and bus schedules at South Kamloops? Will they match up with Dufferin? And what does that look like? We will require time enough to drop off and pick up at both schools daily, morning and afternoon, or would we be busing both kids home?
Good evening. I did have this question the other day, and we do have buses that stop at Dufferin currently, and they carry on to, one carries on to Sa-Hali and one carries on to SKSS. The one after it drops off at Dufferin arrives at SKSS at 8:18. And the one that goes to Sa-Hali is there at 8:20, because after it goes to Dufferin, it goes to Pineview and then down. So all the kids are at school at the same time and on time.
And so we will still continue to run those two buses even with this change?
Yes, we would be able to run those two buses even with the change.
Okay, thank
Because
you.
one's coming in and stopping at Dufferin from Lac Lejeune area, and the other ones are coming from Cherry Creek, Tobiano.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Christensen. So hopefully that answers the question. And if we have the question right, and if not, then
Sorry, Dr. Sullivan, you're muted.
sorry about that. I'll have to go back and repeat myself. So the fifth question about the bus schedule, I did thank Ms. Christensen for answering that question. I moved to the sixth question, which is my older son is at Sa-Hali currently, and my younger son is at Dufferin. Will you allow siblings to stay together at Sa-Hali Secondary? And I think we answered that, and the answer to that is yes, we will keep siblings together in their high schools. Question 7, if you are changing the catchment for Aberdeen and Packway and for Dufferin Pineview, why separate them again into different high schools? So Assistant Superintendent Hamlet, want to take a try to respond to that question.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. So the current catchment high school for Aberdeen is South Kamloops Secondary, and Pacific Way is currently attending Sa-Hali Secondary. Dufferin Elementary is, as you all know, is currently attending Sa-Hali Secondary. Pineview Valley is the one school that I'm not quite sure of, because, well, I am actually, because a lot of those students are going to McGowan, which attends Sa-Hali Secondary, and the other part of that group might be attending Pacific Way, but I'll defer to my colleague, Assistant Superintendent Smiley, for that. So.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, I think generally speaking, if changing the catchment for Aberdeen, Packway, Dufferin, and Pineview is meant to solve the issue of overcapacity issues at Sa-Hali Secondary in the reasonably short term over the next 10 years. And again, as we wait for Pineview, we don't have a date on when that may open. And so there may be another catchment area change, but as we see our planning over time becomes more clear as time passes and we receive more information. So at this time, with everything that we know, it is important that we manage the overcapacity at Sa-Hali. Thank you.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Smiley and Hamlet. And the other thing, when we've had conversations about a new school at Pineview Valley, and our most optimistic projection with respect to that, it will be at least 5 years before we see a new elementary school in Pineview Valley. So you can look at the projections for Sa-Hali Secondary and see where we're going to be in 5 years, and it's just not a tenable situation. So we're going to try to do everything we can to try to relieve some of that pressure at Sa-Hali Secondary, and we think we can do that with some of these changes. There will be situations, I'm sure, individual situations that we did not anticipate, and we intend, of course, to address those with some sensitivity. Question number 8, if parents want to change schools for their children already registered in school, can they request this transfer ahead of 2022? And is this grandfathered in? So if parents want to change schools for their children already registered in school, can they request this transfer ahead of 2022? And is this grandfathered in? So I'm not sure of that question, but the way I'm interpreting it is that if this change is going to occur in 2022, can they change schools ahead of that and do it in 2021? But I may not have the nuances of that correctly. But Mr. Hamlet, if you want to comment, or indeed Ms. Smiley, if you want to comment. We'll start with Mr. Hamlet.
And again, thank you, Dr. Sullivan. If I interpret the question correctly, any transfer would have to follow our district transfer process, and that would, of course, depend on space. That would be a keen consideration in terms of a transfer. I'll defer to Assistant Superintendent Smiley.
I think you've covered it, Assistant Superintendent Hamblett. Thank you.
So hopefully we responded to that question. We're trying to pick up the nuances of that, and hopefully we have responded to that. Number 9, why is the board not making the decision to redirect new and incoming students to the new Catchment High School as of a certain date, rather than forcing current students to move schools? This would keep current youth and parents happy by remaining in schools with established friends and routines. So why is the board not making the decision to redirect new and incoming students to the new Catchment High School as of a certain date, rather than forcing current students to move schools? I'll ask Mr. McDonald to comment, but I anticipate that the reason for that is just not going to do enough to relieve the pressures that we're going to have over the next 5 years, which are increasing significantly with each passing year at Sa-Hali Secondary. But Mr. McDonald, do you want to comment further on that question?
Yeah, the enrollment projections and the revised enrollment projections based on the proposed catchments are based on students moving as of 2022. And again, it's all based on trying to reduce the overcapacity issue at Sa-Hali Secondary.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. The next question is, overcrowding is such an issue now. Why is the board planning to make the change in 2022 rather than in September of 2021? I think there's a number of reasons for that. We certainly want to give parents and families an opportunity to be cognizant of the changes and to be able to make the adjustments that may be necessary. We also want to make sure that we do this carefully and we do this right rather than quick. You know, it's been a challenging year for us, and so we want to give some time to make the adjustments that we have to make, and so we provided this extra year to be able to do that. There's also some other issues with respect to, we have a proposed reopening of Ralph Bell Elementary School. That's going to have to be, we have some issues to deal with there as far as renovating that school and to make sure it's going to be ready for September of 2022. So those types of things. But anybody else, Mr. McDonald or Assistant Superintendent Smiley or Hamlet, any other comments with respect to this extra year of time that we're given to make the adjustments for these changes? Hearing none, I assume that then that is a response to that satisfactory response to that question. Number 11, will youth currently attending Sa-Hali High School be grandfathered to remain at the school with their peer group? If youth are not grandfathered, what criteria needs to be met to apply for an exemption to remain at the current high school? And I think we've answered that. It's been asked in a number of different ways, but the answer is that once you're in Sa-Hali Secondary, that now you're going to remain there until you complete high school. So, and also that applies to siblings as well, so we keep siblings together. Number 12, what is a parent's recourse options with regards to your decision? And I'm not sure of what that means. I assume it means if you're not in agreement with the change from Dufferin as a feeder, Dufferin as a feeder into South Campbell Secondary as opposed to Sa-Hali Secondary, which would I'm assuming I'm not know if I'm assuming this correctly, that if you didn't want your child to go to South Kamloops, you wanted them to remain at Sa-Hali Secondary, then if my assumption is correct, then I would think that you would need then to apply for a transfer to Sa-Hali Secondary as opposed to going to a South Kamloops Secondary. So that completes the questions we have that were submitted in advance, and we have a few questions from the chat. So I want to get into that now. First question, you said 5 years for Pineview. Is that before it opens its doors or 5 years before an announcement? No, I think what we were talking about that, I said our most optimistic prediction is if we were to get the approval on Pineview soon, and we're hoping that we will, by the time we go through all of the process that is required by the ministry, our most optimistic view that if we were able to do all of that in the short term, that school would open its doors probably 5 years downstream. But as I said previously, when you look at the projections for Sa-Hali Secondary during that 5 year period, it's just not a tenable situation. But our most optimistic view is that that school, if it was approved very soon, would open 5 years down the road. Next question from the chat. Have you given any thought to 2-story portables to try and save field space, parking lots, basketball courts, and play areas? I'll ask Mr. McDonald to comment on that, but the issue, I think, is not so much building up or out. The issue is with respect to what the school is able to accommodate. So I'm just looking at the PowerPoint presentation that Mr. McDonald went through with us, and when you look at the actual numbers, so for example, Sa-Hali Secondary has a capacity of 725 students. In 5 years from now, if we don't do anything, it's going to have 1,137 students, and that really, whether you're putting portables, the number of portables going out, or putting the portables on top of each other, the number of students are going to be the same. And so you see the significant consequences of that if we don't make some adjustments with respect to these catchment areas. But Mr. McDonald, you may want to comment further on that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, typically we have not looked at 2-story portables, and there's some technical reasons for that. The main one is accessibility requirements for all of our portables. So a 2-story portable would either require a ramp that would be in the range of, I don't know, 200 feet long, or an elevator. So we have shied away from any of those options currently. Thank you.
Before you go away, Mr. McDonald, another question from the chat. What does 105% in 10 years out mean in the numbers district-wide? So I think that was an average that you would put in there. Do you want to comment on the 105%?
Yeah, that is correct. So when we look at the district as a whole, we would be exceeding our capacity by 5%. So we would be at 105% of our capacity. And again, in the presentation, that's why it's broken out into Kamloops schools, because the district-wide capacity schools includes all of our small rural schools, where we might have a capacity in 150, but there's only 20 students in the school. But we break it out into the Kamloops area just to show the ministry where we have pressures, because the district-wide average doesn't show the individual pressures at certain schools that we're experiencing.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. So one question, portables do not address the lack of places to go to the bathroom. How does the district plan to address this? Well, we're trying to address that issue by changing these catchment areas to reduce the pressure as the number of students go up. And of course, the pressure on bathrooms spaces increased very dramatically. So we need to provide, that's another reason why we need to do the things that we're proposing needs to be done. Another question, will teachers move with students? That is, if 132 additional students move to South Kamloops Secondary in 2022, will South Kamloops get teachers from schools losing the 132 students? So Mr. Hamlet, do you want to comment on that with respect to that's a staffing issue?
Yes, Dr. Sullivan. So staffing is based upon enrollment and complexity of students. So if there is a reduction of students in a school, then the staffing complement for that school would be reduced. The hiring of teachers to another school where there was an increase would have to follow the collective agreement and post and fill language that we have. So if you get a decrease of 100 and an increase of 100 in a corresponding school, conceivably the staff would follow, but it would have to follow the post and fill language of the collective agreement and may not be in fact the same teachers.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hamlet. So that particular issue is covered by the collective agreement, and we would follow the collective agreement provisions with respect to that. Will there be a rebuild of South Kamloops Secondary as one of the oldest schools we have, Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, so the simple answer is I don't know. We do have, in our capital plan, there's different categories that the ministry looks at. The ones we focused on in this presentation are new schools, which is generally where they're focusing the dollars right now to deal with enrollment growth, not just in our district, but in other districts. There is another category in our capital plan for replacement. And South Kamloops Secondary is our #2 priority for replacement schools, with the #1 priority being a replacement school for Dallas Elementary at a higher capacity to deal with all the anticipated growth in that part of Kamloops.
Yeah, and I think the point, just to expand on the point Mr. McDonald made, we're not the only district that is facing this challenge. As I indicated in my remarks, the changes as a result of the Supreme Court decision added 4,100 teachers across the province, and many districts are facing the same challenges that we are. So there's certainly going to be some competition for capital dollars. Our board has been very, very aggressive in pursuing our needs, and I know that they will continue to do so. Next question, when do you expect the new school in Aberdeen? So Mr. McDonald, just get you to comment on these. When do you expect the new school in Aberdeen? And Pineview, I did mention Pineview already, but what about the secondary school in Aberdeen? So what are our projections with respect to where we're going with respect to that?
Well, again, these things are hard to predict because, as I mentioned earlier, it's up to the ministry to provide the funding for these projects. The new high school in Aberdeen, as I presented on one of the slides, is our 3rd priority for new schools. So, even if we're lucky enough to get approved for one school a year, that would put it sort of 3 years out, and then probably 5 years after that, 5 to 6 years for all the approvals we have to go through, the design process, the tender process, and then the construction process. But again, it's hard to predict because we don't know when the ministry will be providing an approval on that school.
So while you're there, just the next question, what is the current success rate between what we ask for with the capital plan and what we actually get from the Ministry of Education? Currently, it doesn't seem great.
Yeah, that's really an impossible question to answer. As everybody knows, we did secure Valley View Secondary. We've got a replacement school for Parkrest Elementary. We've got, I think, about 18 or 20 projects on our capital plan list. Quite a few of those are replacement schools. So that's kind of information I can give you right now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McDonald. Next question, we understand the need to add portables. Besides adding portables, well, what we're trying to do with respect to these proposed catchment changes and boundary changes, and we're trying to reduce or at least not increase the number of portables that are going to be added to schools. At the same time, the problem that we're into is that we don't do anything more. These spaces that we have in schools, which would include LART spaces and other spaces to serve students, are going to be gone because we're going to have to take them for classrooms. So what we're trying to do is, yes, we're trying to address that issue by having play areas for students, by not having to add more portables and taking up more space. And to do that, we're going to have to move forward with at least some changes in these catchment areas so we can redistribute the enrollment pressures, and all schools will have some responsibility, I think, to help absorb those pressures so that we can do exactly what you've outlined we want to do in your question. Last question, the original LRFP plan said no portables for South Kamloops Secondary. Assuming the catchment change occurs, we will be over 100% capacity for the foreseeable future. Does this change the number of additional classrooms and additional portables for South Cam? Well, my understanding is 3 there now. The school is at 92% capacity. Mr. Hamlet, Mr. McDonald, want to comment on that? So it's a school that is not at full capacity, but it has 3 portables now. So I assume that there is some excess space there, and these portables are probably being used for other things. But Mr. Hamlet, want to comment? Mr. McDonald, want to comment?
You are correct. At this time, there is some excess space based on simple capacity calculation. Further out, to answer part of the question, further out, if this catchment change is made, South Kamloops Secondary would require more portables going forward in the future.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. I don't see any further questions. I think we've gone through all of them. One more. Am I being told we have one more? So what I mean is there any thinking outside the box, like taking over existing buildings and turning them into schools, or considering ways to incorporate extra classrooms that don't take up space on a field, like 2-story portables? Well, I think we answered the issue with respect to 2-story portables, but is there any other comment with respect to that particular question, if I'm understanding it right, outside the box, like taking over existing buildings and turning them into schools? I think, I can only speculate, and I'll have to think about that question, but if we're taking over existing buildings, I think you're still going to be splitting up schools because you're still going to be sending students to different places. So if the idea is trying to keep students together, I think we still would have to split students up if we tried to address that. But I would have to think about it more, because as a school, there's certain things that you would need in a school. You need a gymnasium. You need other rooms for other things that you're trying to do to serve students and so on. And I don't know how you would do that. What we're doing with the portables, as challenging as they are, students still have access to gym time. They still have access to washrooms. They still have access to LRT rooms. They still have access to music rooms, all of those types of things. But as we increase the number of portables, then there's going to be less and less access to those things. So I think that's the problem. We want access to those things that a school presently has. So by dividing them up and putting them in other buildings, I'm not sure I know how we would address that, but I would have to think more about that question. So is that, I think that completes the questions we have for this evening. So what I would like to do now is I'd like to turn things back to Chair Kershaw and our Board of Education for any final comments that they would like to make. Chair Kershaw.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. I'll just wait a moment while the rest of the board members get loaded in here. Okay, it looks like we're all here. Thank you for your presentation this evening to all the staff, as well as all the comprehensive questions that came from members of the community. Trustees, do you have any closing comments or questions this evening before we adjourn for the night? Okay. I am seeing none. Thank you all for joining us. To those that are online, just another reminder that this will be available on our website. And we are accepting comments and questions still until the 4th of June, I believe. Although we'll have to double check that. I'm sorry.
You are correct, Chair Kershaw. It will be to the 4th of June.
Thank you. Had a moment. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone.